My name is Naomi Mercer. I am 32 years old, a freelance illustrator, and I have lived in Portland, Oregon my entire life. Last week, I sat in a mahogany-paneled room as my grandfather's will was read. My cousins walked away with the mansion, the fortune, even the family heirlooms. Me. I was handed a crumpled sheet of paper, a map of the estate grounds, with a single line in his handwriting, "Dig where the sun hits first." They laughed, of course. They always laughed. But they do not know that I followed it. And what I found will make them wish they had never been in that room. Before I tell you everything, hit the like button, comment your thoughts and subscribe because this is where it gets dangerous. The air in the Mercer Estate's drawing room felt heavy, almost suffocating. The polished wood walls seemed to swallow sound, leaving only the shuffle of papers and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I sat near the back, trying to disappear into the shadow cast by a towering oak cabinet. My cousins lounged in the front row, draped in designer fabrics, their confidence radiating in smug smiles. The lawyer, Mr. Hartwell, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His voice carried a practiced calm as he began to read my grandfather's will. The mansion, the surrounding acres of land, the investments, the art collection. One by one, the treasures of the Mercer name were handed to my cousins. I watched their faces light up as if they were already spending what they had not yet touched. When Mr. Hartwell reached my name, I braced myself for nothing. For years, I had been the outlier, the quiet shadow to this family's parade of wealth. My life as a freelance illustrator in a small Portland apartment was laughable to them. But instead of nothing, Mr. Hartwell pulled a folded piece of yellowed paper from a sealed envelope. He walked toward me, his expression unreadable, and placed it in my hands. I unfolded it slowly. It was a map, hand-drawn, with faint ink lines that twisted and curved over the estate grounds. In the top corner, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. "Dig where the sun hits first." For a moment I did not move. The room erupted in muffled laughter, some cousins whispering loud enough for me to hear. My cousin Lila leaned toward her brother and smirked. "A treasure hunt. Oh, cute. Maybe she'll find a shovel." My cheeks burned, but I kept my head down, folding the map carefully. I wanted to ask Mr. Hartwell what it meant, but the will reading pressed on, a blur of numbers and property deeds. I felt the weight of the paper in my hands like a stone, as though it carried something heavier than ink. When it was over, people began to scatter. Glasses clinked in the adjoining room as champagne was poured. My cousins stood in little clusters, their laughter bouncing off the walls. No one spoke to me. No one asked about the map. I lingered near the window, watching the long shadows stretch across the lawn outside. The winter sun was low, casting light over the eastern gardens. My grandfather had been a man of habits, mornings in the garden, afternoons in his study. If "where the sun hits first" meant anything, I had a guess where to start. I slipped the map into my coat pocket and left without saying goodbye. Outside, the air bit at my skin, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground. The estate loomed behind me, its windows glinting in the pale sunlight. I walked the long gravel path toward the east gardens, my boots crunching against loose stones. The gardens were quiet, the hedges trimmed to sharp angles, the fountain in the center dry for winter. I glanced at the map again. The ink lines led to a patch of grass just beyond the fountain, at the base of an old cedar tree. I looked up. The sun was sliding across the sky, its light hitting that very spot, golden and warm against the cold. My heart beat faster. I knelt, brushing away damp leaves. The earth beneath felt soft, as though it had been disturbed not long ago. I hesitated, glancing back toward the house. No one was in sight. I dug with my hands at first, breaking through the top layer of roots and soil. Soon my fingers struck something hard, metal, cold and unyielding. I scraped away more dirt until the edges of a small lockbox emerged. It was rusted but intact, its weight solid in my hands. The lock was old, the kind that could be pried open with the right tool. I wiped it clean, my breath clouding in the cold air. Whatever was inside had been hidden here deliberately, away from the eyes of the family. I stood, clutching the box to my chest, and for the first time since stepping into that suffocating room, I felt something close to power. Whatever my grandfather had left for me was not meant for their eyes, only mine. I turned toward the gate, the lockbox heavy in my arms, unaware that behind one of the upstairs windows, a shadow was watching my every move. The lockbox felt heavier with every step I took toward the small side gate. Its cold metal pressed through the fabric of my coat, seeping into my skin. My hands gripped it tightly, not only because it might slip, but because something deep inside me feared someone might try to take it before I could even reach my car. The gravel path crunched underfoot, every sound echoing louder than it should have in the otherwise still air. I glanced back at the mansion once, telling myself it was just to check the distance I'd put between me and them. But my eyes were drawn upward, to a window on the second floor. At first, I thought the glare from the glass was playing tricks on me. Then, the faint outline of a figure shifted behind the curtain. They weren't moving quickly or ducking out of sight. No, it was the stillness that unsettled me. Whoever it was had been watching me for longer than I realized. A shiver slid down my spine. I tightened my hold on the box and kept walking, resisting the urge to break into a run. That would only tell them I had something worth chasing. When I reached the gate, the iron hinges groaned as I pushed it open. Outside the estate grounds, the road stretched in both directions, empty except for the bare winter trees lining its edges. My car was parked a short distance away, its silver frame dulled by a layer of frost. I fumbled for my keys, my eyes flicking back toward the house again. The window was empty now. Sliding into the driver's seat, I set the lockbox gently on the passenger side. The metal clinked against the seatbelt buckle, and I winced at the sound. My fingers itched to pry it open right there, but a strange instinct told me to wait until I was somewhere safer, somewhere private. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the hum of the heater filling the car. I kept glancing at the box as though it might vanish if I looked away for too long. What could be inside? My mind ran through possibilities. Old love letters, photographs, maybe even cash. But none of those explained why my grandfather would hide it beneath the cedar tree, why he would give me a map instead of simply handing it over in the will, and why had someone been watching? By the time I pulled into my street, the winter light was fading, bleeding into a dull gray that clung to the buildings. My apartment was on the second floor of a narrow brick building, the kind with creaky stairs and radiators that hissed like they were alive. I parked, tucked the box under my arm and hurried inside. Once the door to my apartment was locked, I set the box on the kitchen table. It looked even older in the dim light, the rust eating at its edges, the metal warped slightly at one corner. The lock was simple, worn brass, the kind a sturdy flathead screwdriver might pry apart. I fetched one from my drawer and slid it into the narrow gap. With a twist, the lock gave way with a reluctant snap. The lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside, the first thing I saw was a stack of photographs, bound together with a strip of faded ribbon. The images were black and white, their edges curling from age. I pulled them out slowly, flipping through them one by one. The first showed my grandfather younger, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. She had sharp eyes and a half-smile, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In the background, the estate gardens bloomed in full summer light. The next few photographs were stranger. A man I'd never seen before, sitting on a park bench with his head turned slightly toward the camera, as though he knew he was being watched. Another of a car parked beneath an overpass, the driver's face hidden in shadow. Then, an image that made my stomach twist, my mother. She looked younger than I'd ever seen her, maybe 20, her hair loose around her face. She stood in front of the estate gates, her expression somewhere between defiance and fear. I froze, my fingers trembling over the photograph. My mother had left. At least that's what the family always said. Left town. Left me. Left everything. But she had been here at the estate, long enough for someone to take this picture. Beneath the stack of photographs was an envelope, sealed with red wax. My grandfather's initials were pressed into it, The edges of the seal cracked with age. I broke it open and slid out a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as on the map. Omi, if you are reading this, it means you found the box before they did. Inside these photographs is the truth about what happened in this family. You cannot trust anyone who was in that room today. Some of them will try to find this before you understand what it means. Keep the photographs safe. And whatever you do, do not tell them you know about the night in 1987. My breath caught. 1987. That was the year my mother disappeared. I read the letter again, searching for any clue to what he meant. But that was all. No details, no explanation. Just a warning. I set the letter down and reached back into the box. There were more envelopes, each marked with a different year. 1984, 1985, 1986, and so on. I pulled out the one marked 1987. It was thicker than the others, and when I opened it, several small slips of paper fell onto the table. The first was a newspaper clipping. Local woman missing, last seen near Mercer Estate. The photo was grainy, but unmistakable. My mother. Another slip of paper was a handwritten note. The ink had bled slightly, but I could still read it. She knew too much. Tell her to leave before it's too late. There was no signature. A knock at the door made me jump, the papers scattering. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I gathered the photographs and papers quickly, shoving them back into the box, and closed the lid. The knock came again, louder this time. Naomi. It's Lila. Froze. My cousin's voice sounded casual, but there was a slight strain to it, like she was holding something back. I opened the door a few inches, just enough to see her face. She was smiling, but her eyes flicked past me into the apartment. Mind if I come in? She asked. What for? Kept my voice steady. Oh, I just wanted to check in after. Today. She laughed lightly. It must have been weird for you, getting that map. I said nothing, my grip tightening on the edge of the door. Her smile faltered. Anyway, I thought we could have a drink. Ketchup. Maybe talk about Grandpa. I've been thinking a lot about him since the reading. Her gaze shifted again, just briefly, toward the table where the lockbox sat. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. Now's not a good time. Something in her expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. All right, she said slowly. But if you change your mind, she trailed off, giving me a look that lingered a moment too long before she turned and walked down the hall. I waited until her footsteps faded before going back inside and locking the door. My pulse was still racing. I sat at the table again, staring at the box. Lila had not come here to check on me. She had been looking for it. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. You cannot trust anyone who was in that room today. I didn't know who else might be watching or how much time I had before they came back. But one thing was certain. Whatever happened in 1987, and whatever my mother had known, was dangerous enough for my grandfather to bury the truth in the ground. And now that truth was in my hands. I did not sleep that night. The lights stayed on, dimmed to a soft amber glow that painted every object with a thin veil of warmth. It could not push back the chill that had crept in the moment Lila knocked. I kept the lockbox on the table and sat across from it as if it were a person I needed to convince or outlast. Outside, the city hummed in waves, the sound rising and falling with passing cars and late footsteps along the sidewalk. Inside, the apartment was so quiet that the radiator's hissing sounded like words I could almost understand. Sometime after midnight, I made tea I did not drink and lined up the contents of the box in neat rows. Photographs on the left, envelopes by year in the center, the letter from my grandfather on the right. I opened the window a crack for air. Cold seeped in and kept me alert. The photographs demanded patience. Their surfaces had the dull sheen of time, and their corners curled away from the table as if trying to lift off and drift backward into the moments that created them. I began by sorting them into piles. People I knew in one stack. People I did not know in another. Places on the estate in a third. My mother in a fourth. The last pile hurt to look at. In every image of her there was energy in the way she held herself. a taut line between resistance and tenderness that felt like standing on a cliff edge. She wore simple clothes, a thin sweater, jeans, a scarf tied loosely at her neck. Her hair was dark like mine and alive with motion even in stillness. In one photo she faced the camera directly. In another she turned away, caught mid-step as if someone had called her name. I moved to the envelopes. Years written in tight, careful script. I opened them slowly, indexing details in my notebook as I went. 1984 held a list of names and a drawing of a door latch. 1985 contained a receipt for a locksmith and a photograph of a brass key with a square head. 1986 included a note about a new groundskeeper and a snapshot of the orchard fence after a storm. 1987 felt heavier still. I did not reopen it yet. I was not afraid exactly. It was more that I sensed a drop waiting inside it, like the first step down into deep water. Back to the photographs. The garden in spring. The fountain with its dry basin in winter. The cedar tree, taken from 3 angles. Each shot almost identical but with slight differences. A rake leaning against the trunk in one. A spade in another. And in the third, a slice of low morning light catching the roots. My grandfather had been precise. Nothing in this box felt accidental. That meant even the imperfections mattered. I fetched a magnifying glass from my desk. It was old and scratched, but it revealed what my eyes could not see. In the photo of the fountain, I found a silhouette reflected in a shard of cracked tile at the rim. It was not a clear face, only the idea of a person with a brimmed hat. In the orchard photo, a small metal tag hung from the fence post. The number stamped into it was barely visible. I wrote it down. In the snapshots of the main house, several windows were dark, but one had a faint glow. The same window where I had seen movement earlier that day. Second floor, east wing, third window from the corner. I turned to the stack of images that showed my mother. One image was different from the others. It was not centered. The subject leaned too far to the left, leaving a blank space to the right that felt like an invitation. At first I thought it was a mistake, a clumsy shot by someone in a hurry. Then I saw it. A set of numbers penciled faintly along the edge of the white border. Not type. Not printed. Pencil, so light I had to tilt the photo against the lamp to catch the graphite. 7 digits with a dash in the middle. It looked like a phone number but not quite. I wrote it down. It was too short for a modern phone number and too exact to be random. When I held the photo up to the light, another detail surfaced. In the space to the right, barely there, was a chalk mark on the bricks near the gate. A simple arrow pointing east. I knew that wall. I had run my hands along its rough surface when I was a child, counting the bricks as I circled the drive while my mother talked to my grandfather on the front steps. The memory touched down lightly and then lifted, like a bird testing a branch. The image was from near that same spot. The arrow meant something to them. Private signal. Or a warning. I needed a second pair of eyes. Someone who could look at a photograph as a map. Someone with a darkroom and patience. The name that came to mind was Finn. We had met years ago at a gallery opening where nothing on the walls interested him and everything in the people did. He was a photographer who loved the edges of frames more than the center. We drifted in and out of each other's lives the way artists in the same city often do, tied by a thin thread of shared obsession and a memory of whiskey at a table long after closing. I texted him. Too late, I thought. Then the phone buzzed with his reply. Wait, bring it by. I layered the photos in a plain manila folder and slid it into my bag. The lockbox I wrapped in a towel, then taped the towel with blue painter's tape, then placed the parcel inside an old backpack and covered it with sketchbooks. If anyone opened the bag, they would see paper. If anyone asked what was inside, I would say drawings. Outside, the air had the quiet of the hour before dawn, when even the restless parts of a city pause and inhale. Finn lived in a converted warehouse by the river. The drive took 15 minutes if the lights were kind. They were not. I stopped at 2 long reds and watched empty crosswalks glow white and then fade. At the second red light, a dark sedan rolled to a stop 1 lane over. The driver's face was in shadow. I glanced away and then back again. The car stayed beside me when the light turned green and followed as I made a right. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the city was always full of parallel routes and overlapping lives. I made 3 more turns. The sedan took 2 of them and then peeled off. My breath slowed. Kept driving. Finn buzzed me up the moment I tapped the intercom. His place had tall windows and walls lined with framed contact sheets. A string of bulbs hung from the ceiling and flickered with a soft hum like bees. He was barefoot in a heavy sweater, hair pushed back, eyes alert in the way of someone who sleeps in short bursts and knows how to wake hard when the work calls. He poured coffee and set it on the counter without asking if I wanted any. I put the manila folder on the table and slid it toward him. He did not ask questions. He lifted each photograph with careful fingers, tilted it beneath the light, let his gaze run the surface and then the margins. He did not rush. When he reached the image of my mother, he leaned closer. He saw it too. The pencil digits along the border. He fetched a small lamp he used for detail work and brought it near. The numbers were clearer now. 3 digits, a dash, then 4 digits. Not quite a phone number, but a pattern that felt familiar in the body the way a song does before you remember its name. Finn took a breath. He pointed at the chalk mark in the empty space. He traced the arrow in the air and then tapped the image again. His voice had a quiet certainty. Old filming practice, he said. Some photographers used to mark where to frame a subject so the negative could be aligned with a message set in the margin. Not common. But your grandfather would have known techniques old men like to keep. And numbers in pencil on the border sometimes refer to coordinates within a contact sheet. Or a code. He looked up at me. You said your grandfather kept to habits. Yes, I said. Mornings in the garden. Afternoons in his study. He nodded. There are also printer's marks used to align plates. But that would be more precise. This looks like a key for a sequence. Do you have the negatives? Well. He set the photo down and moved to the cedar tree images. He pointed at the rake and the spade and then to the 3rd photo with the low slice of light. He brought his hands up the way he did when he was excited by structure. In triptychs, he said, the 3rd image often locks the sequence. Light is a metronome. If we overlay these 3 and align the common point at the root flare, we might discover what he intended you to see. He scanned the images, printed in large test sheets, and taped them against a window pane. He layered translucent vellum between prints, pencil lines connecting edges to roots to the notch in the bark. He worked in silence. I watched his shoulders shift. The city outside the window brightened from graphite to pewter to the first cold silver of morning. There, he said. He circled a small chip in the bark that appeared in one image and not in the others. It was slight, a rough oval just above the soil line. In the 3rd photo, where the sun feathered across the roots, the oval caught light differently. It looked shallow until you understood it was not shallow at all. It was a cap. The kind used to cover a narrow pipe. A bleed valve, he said. For irrigation. Old estates used to bury a network of pipes under the grounds. You twist the cap, release pressure, and the system drains before winter. If a valve is near a tree, the roots find water and wrap like a fist. I am surprised the tree did not swallow it whole. Bleed valve. The words clicked. The map in my pocket had a cluster of small circles in the eastern garden drawn near that tree. I had not known what they were. Now I did. The circles were not stones or flowers. They were valves. Finn moved on to the photo of the fountain. He adjusted the enlargement until the cracked tile filled the paper, then angled the lamp to draw out the silhouette in the reflection. Brimmed hat, narrow shoulders, a hand lifted to a collar. He looked at me. Who would wear a hat like that? The groundskeeper, I said. I remembered him dimly. A thin man with long fingers and a habit of touching the brim as he passed the porch. He had worked there for years. I did not know if he still did. The envelope labeled 1986 mentioned a new groundskeeper. If the man in the reflection was the old one, then the change had happened after the photo. I wrote it down. Finn pulled another image to the center. This one showed a narrow passage behind the east wing hedges. It was framed oddly low, as if the photographer had been crouching. Near the bottom left edge of the image, a small white stone sat in the grass, shaped like a wedge of bone. It was the only light object within a field of shadow. He grinned. He had that rare grin that appeared when he found a pattern. He tapped the white stone. Look at the way your grandfather uses the lower left corner. He marks the corner in 3 images with something small and bright. This is an anchor. He is walking you through the estate by compass without saying north or south. The anchor shifts position in sequence, and so your brain maps each frame as a step left or right. When you view them in order, your feet would move as if you were there. He wants you to walk a path the photographs draw. He arranged 6 images in 2 rows of 3. The path began at the front gate where my mother had stood and moved behind the east hedges, then past the garden wall, then down a corridor of dogwood trees, then along the orchard fence, then to a small shed that looked more like a greenhouse without glass. The final image was not a place I recognized at all. It was a wall of stacked stone with a narrow door set into it. The door was metal, painted green, and rust ate at the edges in flakes the size of thumbnail parings. I did not know of any door like that on the estate. Finn pulled out a pencil and circled a mark above the door. The number 5 written small. Then he drew my attention to the margin of one of the earlier photos. There was the number 4, faint in the white border. He flipped another over and found a 3. Each margin held a number in ascending order. The image of my mother had a 2 penciled softly along the lower edge. The first in the sequence was the shot of the main house with the glowing window, and in its margin the number 1 through 5. And on the image with the metal door a final mark. Not a 6 symbol. A small cross with a dot at the center. I recognized it. My grandfather used to draw it at the top of the page when he began a new garden plan. He called it sunrise mark. It was his way of anchoring where the light first touched the ground. I pulled the folded map from my coat and set it on the table. Finn leaned in. The map had the same sunrise mark drawn in the top right corner. My grandfather's handwriting pressed the words dig where the sun hits first along that edge. On the map, faint dotted lines traced a route I had not fully understood. But when we laid the photographs along the map, the path snapped into place as if magnets had pulled it home. We had a trail. Started at the front gate. It hugged the east hedges. It moved past the fountain, down the dogwood corridor, along the orchard fence, to the greenhouse shed, and then to a wall of stone I had never seen. The sunrise mark sat just beyond it. I felt the weight of the lockbox again, even though it was closed and wrapped and hidden. The photographs had not been meant to live on a table. They were keys made of light, and I was the lock they fit. Finn poured more coffee. He asked if I planned to go back today. I thought of the figure at the window and the sedan that had shadowed me for 2 turns. I thought of Lila's eyes sliding past my shoulder toward the table with the box. The estate would be awake soon. Staff would move through rooms like slow tides. My cousins would begin plotting their renovations. A new alarm system would be scheduled. Locks would be changed and cameras would multiply like weeds. If I wanted to walk this path with less attention, I needed to go before noon. I asked Finn if he could make copies. He nodded. He moved with calm speed, scanning the photographs at high resolution, printing pairs on archival paper, tucking the originals back into the folder with thin interleaves to protect them. He handed me the copies in a plastic sleeve. He also handed me a small red flashlight no larger than a thumb. For the greenhouse shed, he said. If there is glass missing, there will be nails and shards. You will want to watch your step. I tucked the copies into my bag and rose. He walked me to the door and hesitated. He pulled a brass token from a dish near the entry and pressed it into my palm. It bore an embossed leaf and a number. He said it unlocked the elevator in the old mill building by the river. The elevator did not look like it worked, but it did, and it went to a basement where he kept a second darkroom. If I needed to vanish for an hour, I could. He would not ask why. He would only ask if the light was enough. Outside, The morning had deepened into a pale wash. Ice glazed the edges of the river, and the crows had begun their round of the rooftops. I drove with my hands light on the wheel. I watched the mirrors without being obvious. No sedan followed. The streets near the estate were quiet. I parked 2 blocks away, under a sycamore with mottled bark like the peeling pages of a book. I zipped my coat, looped my scarf and walked. A service gate along the back path stood chained but not locked. The old groundskeeper used to thread the chain through twice to make it look secure. The new one was less careful. The padlock hung open. I slipped through and moved along the hedge line, keeping to the shadows the way the photographs taught me. At the fountain I paused. The cracked tile gleamed wet from a recent thaw. I glanced at the second-floor window in the east wing. It was empty. My breath fogged the air and dissolved. I walked along the dogwood corridor. The branches arched pale against the sky, bare and beautiful, a colonnade built by winter. The orchard fence came into view. I searched for the metal tag and found it on the 3rd post. The number matched what I had written in my notebook. I ran my gloved hand along the top rail. Cold bit through the fabric. A crow watched from the next tree and tilted its head like a judge. The greenhouse shed was smaller than I remembered. Its glass panes had been removed long ago, leaving an iron frame traced by rust. The door hung crooked, its hinge corroded to a powder that stained my fingers when I touched it. Inside, the floor was a mosaic of old soil and broken terracotta. In the corner, an empty shelf bore the outline of pots long moved away. A map of absence. I flicked the red flashlight on and drew a thread of light across the floor. Something under the shelf caught a glint. Crouched and reached. My fingers found a nail head that did not belong to the floor. I brushed soil aside and unearthed a narrow panel of wood about the size of a book. It was not attached. I lifted it and discovered a shallow recess beneath. Empty, except for a small coil of wire and a scrap of paper. I unfolded the paper with cautious fingers. 3 words, written in quick strokes. Turn and listen. Turn what? Listen to what? The words felt like instructions given mid-course. I tucked the scrap into my pocket and stepped outside again. The path from the greenhouse to the stone wall was not visible from here. But the photographs had given me the sequence like breath counts. I stepped right, then straight, then right again. I walked until the ground tilted down slightly and the air went still. The wall revealed itself like a memory surfacing. It was lower than the garden walls and built from flat stones stacked without mortar, the way old boundaries are made to breathe. At its center, half hidden by ivy, a metal door waited. Green paint flaked in petals. I stopped and listened. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Only the light tap of a branch against the wall and the low conversation of crows in the trees. I brushed ivy from the door. Its handle was stiff but not rusted through. Above the handle, someone had carved a small mark. The sunrise symbol with the dot at the center. My grandfather's hand. Beneath the handle, at knee height, there was a second mark I had not seen in the photograph. Tiny arrow pointing down. I knelt and ran my fingers over the stones below the door. One stone was different. Gave slightly under pressure. I pressed harder and felt a click. A soft hiss answered from within the wall. I stood quickly and stepped back. The door did not open. The hiss faded. A moment passed. Then I heard it. Hollow thump like a weight shifting. Pressed the handle. The door moved inward by a hair and then stopped, held by a chain on the other side. The gap was barely wide enough for fingers. I pulled a thin metal ruler from my coat pocket and slid it through the opening, fishing for the chain. The ruler caught and slipped. I tried again, angled differently, and felt the metal touch the chain. I lifted and unhooked it. The chain fell with a small clatter against stone. The door opened into cool air and darkness that smelled of damp peat and old iron. I stood inside the threshold and let my eyes adjust. My breath made white blossoms in the dim. At first I saw nothing but a corridor with dirt floor and stone walls. Then the shape of shelves emerged on the left. On the right, a narrow bench ran the length of the passage. An old work lamp hung from a hook, its cord draped to a socket that looked like it had not carried current in years. I did not try to switch it on. I used the red flashlight and kept the beam low. On the shelves sat jars, empty and clean, and wooden boxes with metal handles. The boxes had labels, but the ink had bled. I opened the first box and found seed packets tied with string. The next held plant tags stamped with names of varieties. The third was different. It contained envelopes identical to the ones in my apartment, each marked with a year. I counted from the back. The last year in this set was 1988. The envelopes in the lockbox had ended at the same year. If there had been more, they were not here. Or they had been taken. I searched the bench and found a small hand pump with a rubber hose attached. A bleed valve key hung on a peg near the door. Took it down. I would return it. For now it belonged in my pocket. On the far wall, a large metal cabinet stood against the stone. Its door was latched with a simple hasp. I lifted the hasp and opened it. Inside were 3 shelves. On the top shelf, more envelopes, larger and heavier. On the middle shelf, a leather ledger with a strap. On the bottom shelf, a tin box with a dial. The kind of safe that pretends not to be a safe. I did not touch the tin box. Not yet. My hand went to the ledger. The strap creaked when I loosed it. The leather had the smell of libraries and lemon oil. Inside, the pages were lined with careful handwriting. My grandfather's hand recorded dates and tasks in the garden. But halfway through, the ledger changed. The lines shifted from plantings and prunings to names and sums. Payments. Notes written with restraint. The entries were coded with initials, not full names. But besides some of the initials, faint pencil notations clarified the identity. Groundskeeper. House manager. Elliot Mercer. S. Naomi Sinclair. My name, noted once, dated the year I turned 7, with no sum attached, only a line that read afternoon at the east wall. I felt the page as if it might have a heartbeat. I turned another page and found a pressed flower sealed under clear tape. Beneath it a sentence. She comes back, show her the map. Do not let the others know. The date was 2 weeks before my mother disappeared. I heard a sound and froze. Scrape. Breath. The faintest disturbance of air at my back. I clicked the flashlight off and leaned into the darkness. The cold wrapped me in its cloth. Waited. The sound did not come again. Maybe it had been the door settling. Maybe the wall breathed like old stone does. I stood without moving for a slow count of 90. Then I switched the light on again and returned the ledger to the shelf, the strap tight. I did not open the tin box. Not yet. I took one envelope from the top shelf, the one marked with a quiet mark I recognized. The sunrise symbol with the dot. Inside were photographs rolled tight and a thin strip of vellum with numbers printed in a narrow column. I did not unroll them. I placed the envelope into my bag and closed the cabinet. I hung the valve key back on its peg. I shut the door and slid the chain. I pressed the loose stone back into place until I heard the click. On the path back toward the greenhouse, I kept to the hedges. The crows had moved on. The daylight had shifted from silver to a clearer white that revealed footprints on the damp ground. Mine were deep and recent, but they were not alone. A second set crossed mine near the dogwoods and angled toward the service lane. The shoe was narrow and the heel left a sharp crescent. Lila wore heels even in the morning. She had been here. Or someone who dressed like her. I followed the prints to the lane and watched them vanish into gravel. I returned to the car by a different route, through a side yard where stone urns sat like sleeping guards. I felt the envelope in my bag and the slow drum of my pulse and the way the morning had sharpened all sounds. I did not look back at the second floor window. I did not look at the fountain. I did not breathe deep until I was behind the wheel and the engine turned over and the radio whispered static. Back at my apartment, I locked the door and slid the chain. I set the new envelope on the table beside the lockbox and paused. The apartment was too quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of a held breath. I scanned the room. A chair had shifted 2 inches. A stack of magazines leaned at a different angle. The blue painter's tape on the backpack had a new crease as if a thumbnail had tested it. I closed my eyes and listened. No one else here. But someone had been here. The lock showed no damage. The latch looked untouched. There were ways in and out of a building that did not pass through doors. I unrolled the photographs from the envelope with care. These were not garden scenes. They were documents. A deed to a parcel of land 3 miles east of the estate. A letter of incorporation for a company whose name I had never heard. A ledger page that did not match the ledger in the wall. Numbers moved across it like masked birds. The vellum strip with numbers fell across the images like a thin veil. When I laid it over the deed, certain words lifted. When I laid it over the letter of incorporation, a line emerged beneath the printed text. Not printed, written in faint graphite, said, "If you read this, follow the water. Follow the water." The estate sat near a river that ran shallow in summer and brown in winter. An irrigation map must exist somewhere. Perhaps in the study. Perhaps in the room with the glowing window. The bleed valves would trace the old lines. If I followed them out of the garden and across the property line, I might find where the pipe crossed into the parcel east of the estate. If my grandfather had hidden something beyond the reach of family deeds, he had done it with the patience of a man who understood roots. I took photographs of the documents with my phone and stored the originals in a fireproof pouch. I made a copy of the key to the wall in my notebook with a rubbing of graphite and tape. I labeled everything in a neat hand I used when illustration work required precision. I ate a piece of toast without tasting it and drank cold tea and let the radiator hiss like an ally. Near noon, a text arrived from an unknown number. Contained 3 words. "Did you find it? No name. No follow-up." I did not respond. I turned off the phone and put it in the freezer. A habit I had once mocked when a friend swore it dulled tracking signals. I did not know if it would help. I needed the feeling that I had done something more than wait. I returned to the table and studied the photographs again. I thought of the chalk arrow on the wall near the gate. I traced the path across the map with my finger. I thought of the ledger entry that noted my name and the afternoon at the east wall. I tried to conjure the day. I was 7. My mother stood in sun, head bent close to mine. My grandfather's voice came from the side, low, not unkind. A small stone warm in my hand. The feel of ivy against brick. Smell like coins. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sky had cleared to a hard winter blue. Somewhere, water moved under ice and found a way around obstacles with the stubborn grace only water knows. I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the cold travel through bone. My mother had not run. She had followed a path. My grandfather had left me the same path, not to money or jewels, but to a shape of the truth that could not easily be erased by a new will or a smile at a lawyer's table. On the counter, the kettle clicked and hummed. I filled a mug and warmed my hands around it. Then I packed the photographs and the map and the copied documents. I placed the lockbox back in the backpack and taped it again, 2 strips this time, crisscrossing. I pulled on my boots and my coat and the scarf with its worn place where I worried the fabric when I needed to think. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. I paused long enough to hear my neighbor's radio through the wall, a tinny song from decades ago. The notes bent and held and then let go. I headed for the stairs, the envelope tucked beneath my coat. The light on the landing flickered and steadied. The day felt like a hinge and I was the pin moving within it. I could feel the line of the irrigation pipes beneath the earth as if they were veins under skin. I could feel the way my grandfather had drawn his map and how the photographs matched its pulse. I could feel the valley of noon narrowing. I walked faster. The road back to the estate felt different this time. Not because of the traffic, which was light, or the weather, which had settled into a brittle winter calm, but because I now knew there were layers beneath everything. Beneath the ground, beneath the walls, beneath the story my family had told for decades. I kept thinking about those 3 words on the vellum strip. Follow the water. They had the same weight as my grandfather's note on the map. Neither told me exactly what to do, but both carried the same tone. They were not suggestions. They were instructions. And they came from someone who had known he wouldn't be around to explain them. I parked farther away this time, nearly half a mile from the estate, in the lot of a shuttered garden center. The air smelled faintly of damp mulch, the ghost of its past seasons lingering. I zipped my coat and pulled my scarf high. The sky had dulled to pewter, a lightless ceiling that pressed down on the bare trees. The estate's eastern edge bordered an old path, little more than 2 tire tracks worn into the frozen ground. It ran parallel to a narrow irrigation ditch, now mostly dry but with patches of thin ice clinging to its edges. I kept to the ditch's far side, crouching when I needed to, letting the hedge line shield me from any view from the house. The map in my pocket was soft from handling, the folds weakening where I had traced the route again and again with my finger. I reached the point where the dotted line marked the east wall. The hedge gave way here, thinning into skeletal branches that rattled in the wind. And there it was. The east wall rose before me, its surface a patchwork of old bricks and creeping ivy. It wasn't as tall as I remembered from childhood, but it still had that same air of secrecy. In the lower corner where the bricks met the ground I saw it, the chalk arrow. The same one from the photograph. Time had faded it, but the mark was still there, shielded from the weather by the overhang of ivy. My mother must have stood right here when that picture was taken. The idea that she might have touched this same patch of brick with her fingertips, decades ago, made the air feel heavier around me. I crouched and brushed away the brittle leaves at the base of the wall. The soil here was different from the surrounding ground, looser, darker, as though it had been disturbed more recently, not just by time or weather but by human hands. I slid on a pair of gloves from my pocket and began to dig. At first it was slow work, breaking through the frozen crust of earth, but soon the soil gave way to softer layers. Then my fingers hit something hard. It was metal again, but not like the lockbox from the cedar tree. This was flat, rectangular, and wide. I brushed away more dirt until I saw the edge of a panel, its surface painted a dull, weathered green. The same green as the metal door behind the stone wall. I cleared more of it and realized it was a hatch, set flush with the ground and locked with a small, circular mechanism. I pulled out the bleed valve key from my coat pocket and tested it against the lock. Fit. The key turned with a stiff resistance, then clicked. I lifted the hatch slowly, its hinges protesting in a low groan. Cold air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying with it the scent of earth and stagnant water. Inside was a narrow shaft lined with brick. An old iron ladder descended into the dark, vanishing after a few feet. The space was too narrow for comfort, just enough for a person to climb down one at a time. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. Water glimmered faintly far below, a still black pool reflecting the light like an eye. Pipes ran along the walls, their metal slick with condensation. Somewhere in that darkness, water was moving, even if I couldn't hear it. I hesitated. This was the kind of place you didn't enter lightly. Not just because of the danger of being caught, but because once you went down you had no quick way out. But the words on the vellum were not going to leave me alone until I did. I began my descent. The metal rungs were cold, biting through the gloves. My breath echoed against the brick, the sound magnified in the tight space. Halfway down I paused to look up. The hatch was just a rectangle of gray light now, the world above already feeling far away. When my boots touched the bottom, the air was damp and close. The water covered most of the floor, shallow near me but deepening toward the far end. I crouched, shining the light along the walls. It was here I saw something unexpected. Scratches on the brick, faint but deliberate. Lines, arrows, and small circles etched into the surface, as though someone had tried to draw another map down here. I followed the markings until they ended at a section of wall where the mortar had been removed from between 2 bricks. The gap was just wide enough to slip a hand inside. My fingers touched metal again. This time, a small tin cylinder with a screw top. I pulled it free and unscrewed the lid. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, bound with twine. I slid it out and unrolled it. It was another map, but this one didn't show the estate grounds. It showed the irrigation system, the old one, not the modern upgrades. And there, at the very edge of the property line, was a small marked square. The ink was darker there, almost fresh compared to the rest. As I traced the lines with my gloved finger, a faint sound broke the silence above me. A creak like weight shifting on metal. Hatch. I killed the flashlight instantly and pressed myself against the wall. My breath slowed. Another sound followed. A faint clink, metal against metal, as though someone were testing the lock from above. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped. A long pause followed, heavy with the sense of being measured, of someone deciding whether to commit to the descent. Then the hatch closed, its groan echoing down the shaft. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it felt occupied, as though the air had absorbed a new presence. I slipped the map into my coat and climbed the ladder quickly, my hands stinging from the cold. When I emerged, I looked around. The hedge rustled faintly in the wind, but I saw no one. Still, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Not here. Not in this search. And whoever it was, they knew exactly where I had been. The air outside the hatch was colder than it had been when I went in. Or maybe it was just my blood cooling from the shock of knowing someone had been there, watching, close enough to touch the lock. I lowered the hatch gently back into place, letting it settle without a sound. The hedge shielded me from the house, but the stillness of the estate grounds was deceptive. Whoever had been at the hatch could have slipped away into any of the dozens of paths that threaded through the property. I stayed low and moved toward the irrigation ditch, keeping the east wall at my back. The map I had taken from the tin cylinder was folded into a flat square in my pocket, but its lines had already etched themselves into my mind. The main irrigation trunk running like a spine down the estate, the thinner branches feeding off it, and the tiny marked square at the farthest edge of the property. The ditch was mostly frozen, but here and there thin sheets of ice broke under my boots with a muted crack. I followed its curve until the hedge opened into a stretch of open field. The grass here was brittle, the color of old rope, and in the distance the land sloped down toward a tree line that marked the property's end. Beyond it lay land I didn't recognize, a low sprawl of winter meadow dotted with skeletal shrubs. Check the sky. The heavy gray had begun to shift, lightening in places, but there was no sun, no warmth to give away the hour. I needed to reach the square on the map before the groundskeepers began their midday rounds. The further I walked, the quieter the estate felt. The sounds of the house and its invisible machinery faded, replaced by the soft rattle of seed pods on dry stems. The ditch narrowed here, the ice clearer, the water beneath moving slowly. I crouched once to touch it. The cold sank through my glove, the flow steady but weak. The square on the map was near a bend in the irrigation line, where the ditch turned sharply west before disappearing into a stand of bare alders. I moved into the trees and found a tangle of undergrowth that had grown up around what looked like a collapsed section of stone wall. The irrigation pipe ran just beneath it, half exposed where the soil had eroded. I knelt and brushed away the dead leaves. A circular metal plate lay embedded in the earth, its surface streaked with rust. The faint outline of a sunrise symbol had been scratched into it, the same mark my grandfather used on the garden map. I took the bleed valve key from my pocket and fitted it to the center. The lock turned reluctantly, metal grating against metal. Then the plate shifted, swinging up to reveal a cavity lined with brick. Inside was a box, wooden this time, bound with a wide leather strap. It was smaller than the lockbox from the cedar tree but heavier than it looked. I lifted it out and rested it on my knees. The leather was stiff, cracked in places, but the buckle opened easily. Beneath it, the lid was fastened with two small brass catches. I unhooked them and eased the lid open. The first thing I saw was fabric, folded, dark blue, smelling faintly of cedar. I lifted it out carefully. It was a scarf, the kind my mother used to wear in the winter, patterned with small white flowers. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled many times. Beneath the scarf lay a stack of papers tied together with string. The top sheet was a letter in my grandfather's hand. The ink was darker here, the strokes slower, as though he had taken his time writing it. Omi, if you've found this, you've followed the water as I meant you to. You have what they wanted to bury and what she, your mother, wanted to protect. The scarf was hers. Keep it with you. Inside this bundle are the records they tried to destroy, but there is one more thing you must find before you can understand them. The last place is not on any map. It's in the window that glows. I read the last sentence twice, my pulse quickening. The window that glows. I had seen it that day from the garden. The second floor, east wing, third window from the corner. I untied the string and flipped through the papers. There were photocopies of legal documents, letters signed with initials I didn't recognize, and pages torn from ledgers filled with numbers. Some were stained with water, the ink blurred. Others had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. One letter stood out. It was addressed to my grandfather but unsigned. The paper was creased and brittle, but the message was clear enough. She won't leave without proof. If you can't convince her, I will make sure she never comes back. The air around me seemed to thin. The she could only be my mother. And whoever wrote this had been willing to do more than just frighten her away. I was still staring at the letter when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere to my left. Not loud but close. Too close. I slid the papers and the scarf back into the box, closed the lid, and fastened the catches. Another sound followed. A slow step through the brittle grass. I rose to my feet, the box tucked under my arm, and moved toward the opposite side of the alder stand. The ground here sloped down toward a narrow strip of woodland that bordered the property. I ducked into the trees, weaving between trunks until the field was out of sight. The steps behind me grew faint but didn't stop. Whoever it was, they were not in a hurry. They knew I would try to run, and they were patient enough to follow. I angled my path back toward the service road that led to the old gate. My boots slipped once on a patch of ice, the box nearly falling from my grasp. I kept moving, the cold air burning in my lungs. By the time I reached the gate, my hands were numb. The padlock hung open again, the chain threaded loosely through the bars. I slipped through, glancing once over my shoulder. The trees were still. The road beyond the gate was empty. My car was 2 streets away. I kept to the sidewalk, forcing myself not to look back again until I reached it. When I finally slid behind the wheel, I set the box on the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, listening to my breathing. The scarf was in there. My mother's. My grandfather had hidden it where no one else would find it. And now there was only one place left to go. The window that glows. By the time I reached my apartment, the winter light had flattened into that gray, suspended hour before evening. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and set the wooden box on the kitchen table. My fingers rested on the lid longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it again. The weight of something my grandfather had deliberately chosen to keep from every other member of the Mercer family. The scarf lay folded at the top where I'd placed it earlier. I lifted it out and draped it over my hands. The fabric was soft but thin, the edges fraying in the same way I remembered from my childhood. It had always been my mother's favorite, something she'd wear even in the mild chill of autumn. I brought it to my face. The faint scent of cedar still lingered, like a breath from a place untouched for decades. The papers inside the box were more dangerous than sentimental. I didn't need Finn to tell me that. The copies of legal documents alone could unravel years of carefully maintained lies, if they were real. But my grandfather had been careful, precise. He wouldn't have left me anything that could be dismissed as forgery. I set the papers aside and studied the letter again. The last line burned in my mind. The last place is not on any map. It's in the window that glows. That window had been in the east wing, 2nd floor, 3rd from the corner. I'd seen it from the garden that first day. A faint light behind the glass while the rest of the house loomed in darkness. It was inside the estate. I didn't like the idea of going back in. Not when it was crawling with family, staff, and possibly the person who'd been shadowing me. But there was no way around it. If the glowing window held the final piece my grandfather meant me to have, then waiting would only give someone else time to find it first. I needed to move carefully. By nightfall, the estate would be quieter, but not silent. My cousins and the remaining relatives often stayed late, drinking in the drawing room or smoking on the veranda. The staff moved through their routines with the discipline of a clock. Rooms cleaned in the morning, kitchens busy in the afternoon, floors polished just before the evening crowd emerged. I had to get in during that narrow gap after the evening meal, when the house seemed momentarily still. I didn't have a key, but I didn't need one. I still remembered the narrow servants' entrance on the north side, hidden behind a half wall and a row of evergreen shrubs. The lock had been replaced since I was a child, but the door itself was old and warped. A flathead screwdriver and enough pressure in the right spot would get me inside. I dressed in dark clothes, tied my hair back, and tucked the scarf under my coat, not just for warmth, but because I wanted it close. Felt like carrying a part of my mother with me. I packed the bleed valve key, my flashlight, and the copied photographs Finn had given me. I left my apartment just after sunset. The streets near the estate were quiet, the cold keeping most people indoors. I parked several blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, sticking to the shadows where the street lamps didn't quite reach. The servants' entrance was exactly where I remembered it. The shrubs had grown thicker, their branches brushing against the wall in the wind. I crouched, slipped between them and tested the lock. The screwdriver bit into the soft wood around the latch. A sharp push, and the door gave way with a muted click. Inside, the air was warmer, laced with a faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. The corridor was narrow, lit only by a single dim bulb near the far end. I closed the door behind me, listening for any sign of movement. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you aware of every sound your own body made, every breath, every shift of your shoes against the floor. I moved quickly, keeping to the narrow service hallways I'd half forgotten but my body still remembered. The east wing's staircase was at the far end of a long corridor lined with storage rooms and old wardrobes. The wood steps creaked under my weight no matter how carefully I moved. The sound swallowed into the thick stillness of the house. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead. The air cooler here, the smell of dust stronger. Doors lined both sides, most of them closed. The third window from the corner would be in the room on my right. I reached the door and listened. Nothing. The handle turned easily. The hinges didn't creak. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a thin sliver of light leaking from the covered window. The curtains were heavy, drawn closed, but a faint glow filtered through the fabric. I crossed the room and pulled them back just enough to see outside. The gardens below were silvered in the faint moonlight. I turned my attention to the room itself. It was furnished like a small study. One desk, 2 armchairs, and a bookshelf against the far wall. A thick layer of dust coated most surfaces, except for the desk, which was clean. Too clean. The top drawer was locked. I crouched and tried the bleed valve key out of habit. It didn't fit, but the lock was old brass. I used the screwdriver again, applying steady pressure until the mechanism gave with a quiet pop. Inside the drawer was a ledger, smaller than the one I'd found behind the stone wall, and a narrow wooden box the length of my forearm. I set the ledger aside and opened the box. It held a row of small glass vials, each sealed with wax. The liquid inside ranged in color from amber to deep brown. Tucked beside them was an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's hand. Tore it open. If you've reached this room, you've found what I could not give you in the open. These vials contain the proof of what was done to her, your mother, and what they planned for you. Keep them sealed until you are ready to show them. Do not trust the doctors. Do not trust the police. The truth will kill them before it saves you. I read it twice, my pulse in my throat. A sound from the hallway snapped my attention up. A slow step, the weight measured. Then another. The floorboard outside groaned under a shift of weight. I slid the vials back into the box, closed it, and tucked it inside my coat. The ledger went in next. I moved to the far side of the room, keeping low, and waited. The handle turned. The door opened an inch. A shadow crossed the thin slice of light from the hallway. And then, without a word, the door closed again. I didn't breathe until the footsteps faded down the hall. Whoever it was, they had known I was here, and they had chosen to let me go. Now, I stayed still for a full 30 seconds after the last footstep faded, counting in my head to make sure my breathing was quiet and even. My fingers pressed against the vials beneath my coat, feeling the glass through the fabric. The ledger was wedged against my ribs, its corners digging into me with every slow inhale. Whoever had been at the door had made a choice. They could have stepped inside. They could have called out. They could have ended this hunt right here. Instead, they had left me in place like a piece they didn't want to move just yet. That was worse. I eased the desk drawer shut and crossed to the window again, peeking through the curtain. The gardens below were the same pale silver as when I entered, but now I noticed movement. Just a ripple of shadow slipping between the hedge lines. Too quick to identify. It was time to get out. The hall outside was empty. I kept my steps measured, letting the creaks of the floorboards fall in a slow rhythm so they might be mistaken for the settling of the house. At the end of the hall, I reached the stairs to the service corridor. Halfway down I heard it. Not footsteps behind me this time, but ahead. Soft, deliberate, as if someone was matching their pace to mine. Stop. The sound stopped. Long pause. Then, from somewhere lower down, a door closed. Not slammed, just closed firmly, the latch catching with a click that felt final. Kept going. The narrow hallway at the bottom was dimmer than before, only one of the two bulbs burning. The shadows stretched longer, swallowing the corners. I moved toward the north entrance I'd used before, every step careful. When I reached it, my stomach tightened. The door was shut, but the latch hung twisted in the frame, the screwdriver marks fresh. Someone had forced it from the outside after I came in. I tried the handle anyway. Whoever it was, they'd made sure I couldn't leave the same way. I turned back down the hall, passing a row of old storage closets. The air smelled faintly of polish and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. I kept moving toward the kitchen, hoping to find the back veranda door unlocked. The kitchen light was off, but the moonlight through the wide windows showed enough. Stainless steel counters, empty racks, a long butcher's table bare except for a single envelope placed dead center. I stopped in the doorway. The envelope was unmarked. I approached slowly, the quiet pressing in like a held breath. When I reached the table, I saw that the flap was tucked but not sealed. I slid a finger inside and drew out a single piece of paper, folded once. Opened it. In the center of the page, written in dark ink in a careful, unfamiliar hand, were 5 words. You're going the wrong way. The kitchen felt colder suddenly, as if the draft had teeth. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows near the pantry door, the dark corners of the far counters. No movement. I folded the note and slipped it into my coat. There were 2 other exits from the kitchen. One led through the main dining hall toward the grand staircase. The other, narrower, fed into a corridor that ran behind the east wing and eventually opened onto the side gardens. Chose the side corridor. It was darker here, the only light coming from small, high windows with warped glass. The floor sloped slightly, just enough to make each step feel like it might carry you faster than you meant to go. I realized too late that it did not open directly to the gardens anymore. At some point years ago maybe, someone had added an interior door with a bolt. The bolt was locked from the other side. I tested it quietly, then pulled back and let my eyes adjust to the dim. This was the moment my pulse began to drum. Not because I was trapped exactly, but because I understood now that every path I took had been chosen for me. The locked servant's door. The envelope in the kitchen. This bolted exit. They were steering me. I turned back toward the kitchen, only to stop short. A figure was standing at the far end of the hall. They were backlit by the faint spill of light from the dining hall, their features hidden, their shoulders broad beneath a long coat. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood blocking the way. I took a step back, then another. The figure followed, slow and steady. I glanced to my left. There was another door there, one I didn't remember. A narrow frame wedged between 2 storage cupboards. The handle was brass, cold under my hand. Turned easily. The space beyond was unlit, smelling faintly of paper and dust. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut just as the figure's footsteps reached the midpoint of the hall. I was in some kind of records room. Rows of shelves rose up around me, stacked with boxes and leather-bound volumes. My flashlight's beam caught the dust motes in the air, the gleam of old brass labels. I moved deeper between the shelves, putting distance between myself and the door. Somewhere behind me, a hinge groaned softly, the unmistakable sound of the door opening again. They had followed me in. The rows of shelves formed narrow aisles, some ending in dead ends, others looping back. My boots whispered against the worn carpet as I wove between them, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. A shadow crossed at the far end of an aisle, tall enough to reach the shelf tops. They were not hurrying. This wasn't a chase. It was a funnel, and I was already in its throat. The rows of shelves felt closer the deeper I went, their sides lined with ledgers, leather-bound books, and cardboard archive boxes that smelled of glue and mildew. The air was thick, unmoving, and every sound carried farther than it should have. The faint crackle of paper under my fingertips, the low creak of the building settling, the near-silent brush of footsteps that weren't mine. I crouched low, letting my flashlight beam skim just above the floor. The carpet was worn in narrow trails where generations of feet had passed, and I followed one until it reached a back wall lined with locked cabinets. The brass handles were dulled with age, the keyholes shaped like tiny shields. The footstep behind me was slower this time, deliberate in its patience. Whoever was here didn't want me to panic. They wanted me to keep moving until I reached the place they decided I should go. I forced myself to think. A funnel works both ways. You can be driven toward the end, or you can turn the narrow walls into cover. I slid my flashlight into my coat pocket and slipped between two shelves, pausing near the middle. My breathing was shallow now, controlled as I listened. The steps shifted in direction. They were tracking me by sound. I moved again, quieter this time, my boots barely grazing the floor. In the far corner of the room, a strip of wall was visible between the shelving. On it, unlike the rest, hung a framed floor plan of the estate, yellowed with age, its corners curled slightly under the glass. I crossed the last few feet quickly and studied it. It wasn't the current layout. It was older, drawn in the kind of inked precision my grandfather favored. The east wing was different here, with more storage rooms and fewer bedrooms. And there, at the far end of the corridor I'd been heading toward earlier, was a small square labeled Annex Archive. I ran my finger along the thin lines that connected it to the rest of the house. Only one door led inside. Choke point. If my stalker knew this layout, they could trap me there easily. But something else caught my attention. In the margin of the map, drawn so faintly it could be mistaken for a crease, was the sunrise symbol. It sat in the corner near the annex, not in any of the main rooms, but in a small space labeled Ledger Vault. The same mark my grandfather had used for the garden map. The same one he'd carved above the stone wall door. A floorboard groaned behind me. I turned, but the aisle was empty. The light from the hallway didn't reach this far, leaving the shelves in shadow. I moved quickly now, following the edge of the room until I found a narrow service door at the end. It was unlocked. The space beyond was narrow, lit by a single bare bulb. Boxes were stacked along one wall, their edges stamped with dates going back decades. The far end had a door with a brass plate. Ledger Vault. The lock was simple, one of the old skeleton key types. I tried the bleed valve key on instinct. The teeth didn't match, but the thin shaft slid far enough to catch on something. I twisted gently. Soft click answered. Inside, the vault was smaller than I expected. 3 shelves lined the back wall, each holding flat drawers like a map case. The smell of old paper was stronger here, undercut by something faintly chemical. Preservatives, maybe. The middle drawer opened easily, revealing rows of leather-bound ledgers identical in size and shape. Their spines bore no labels, but each had a small tag tied to it with twine. Dates, written in my grandfather's hand. I pulled one at random, 1987. The cover was stiff, the leather cracked at the edges. Inside, the pages were filled with his neat script, detailing daily expenses and transactions. But halfway through, the format changed. Whole pages were devoted to names, cross-referenced with coded notations. Some were marked with an X, others with the sunrise symbol. A sudden draft brushed my neck. Froze, listening. The door to the vault was still open. In the narrow gap between it and the wall, a figure stood. The same tall outline from the hallway. They stepped inside slowly, not rushing, closing the door behind them. The bulb above flickered once. I kept the ledger in my hands, holding it like a shield even though it was nothing of the kind. They stopped a few feet away. In the dim light, I could just make out the pale line of their jaw, the dark fall of hair over their forehead. Their eyes were on the ledger, not me. When they finally spoke, their voice was low, steady, and too familiar. "You weren't supposed to find that." I knew the voice. It was Lila. Lila stepped further into the narrow vault, letting the door click shut behind her. The sound echoed against the close walls, a quiet lock on a cage neither of us could leave without passing the other. Her eyes stayed on the ledger in my hands. In this dim light, her pupils looked huge, swallowing the pale hazel I remembered from childhood. She wasn't smiling. That, more than anything, made my pulse spike. "You've been busy," she said. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, but there was a current beneath it. Tight, controlled. "The garden. The cedar tree. Now here. You've been walking his trail." I didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, as though testing how I'd react to the smallest movement. "You think you're the only one he left crumbs for." The ledger felt heavier. "He didn't trust you," I said. That got a flicker. A tiny shift in her expression, not anger exactly, but something sharper. "Maybe not. But he didn't trust you either, Naomi. You just happened to be the last one left who could stomach the smell of dirt." She took another step forward, closing the space between us. Her perfume was faint but sharp in the close air, citrus and something metallic. "What do you want?" I asked. Her gaze slid to the shelves, to the drawers lining the walls. "What's in here belongs to all of us. But you're the only one he made it into a game for. The maps, the keys. I think he wanted to see if you could win." I held the ledger tighter. "Win what?" "That," she said, pointing at it. "And whatever it leads to. The vials you took from the East Wing, for example." My chest tightened. I hadn't told anyone about those vials. Not Finn, not anyone. "How do you know about them?" Her mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. "Because I was in that room before you were. I just didn't take them." The ledger's weight seemed to double again. "Why not?" "Because I didn't need to," she said simply. "I already know what's in them. And if you were smart, you'd put them back where you found them before someone decides you're dangerous enough to deal with." Her tone on those last words was light, but the meaning in her eyes was not. I took a step toward the far wall, putting more distance between us. "The only people who are dangerous," I said, "are the ones who don't want the truth to come out." Her gaze locked on mine, and for a moment there was no mask, no cousinly pretense, just a flash of something cold, practiced, and certain. "Then you're in the wrong family," she said. The bulb above us buzzed, then flickered twice before steadying. In that brief stutter of darkness, I heard the soft scrape of her shoe against the floor. She was moving closer again. "Hand me the ledger, Naomi," she said quietly. "Walk away from this, and I'll make sure you leave here without anyone following you." I glanced at the door behind her. She was too close to it now, blocking the only exit. If I refused, this would end badly. If I gave it to her, I'd lose one of the few pieces my grandfather had meant for me to have. The seconds stretched, the air thick with a smell of paper and dust and something sharper, the same metallic note in her perfume. My mind was already working the angles. And then, from somewhere outside the vault, came the faint sound of footsteps. Not hurried, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to be a man's. Lila's head turned toward the door. Her jaw tightened. "Looks like we're not alone," I said. Her eyes snapped back to mine. "Stay here." She slipped out of the vault quickly, her coat brushing the frame. The door clicked shut, but this time I didn't hear the latch catch. I stood still for a beat, my ears straining. The footsteps outside had paused. A low murmur followed. Two voices, one of them hers, the other deeper, harder to place. The exchange was brief, clipped, ending in the sound of retreating steps. When the hallway was silent again, I pulled open the door just enough to see. The corridor was empty. The ledger was still in my hands, and I was still free for now. But the look in Lila's eyes before she left told me one thing. Whatever this ledger led to, she wasn't going to let me reach it first. The vault smelled even older after Lila left, as if the air had been holding its breath and now exhaled all at once. I closed the door softly behind me and leaned against it, listening to the silence. My fingers tightened around the ledger. If Lila knew about the vials and the ledger, she knew more than she was saying. That meant the only advantage I had left was time. Time to read. Time to find what my grandfather had buried in these pages before she returned with reinforcements. I sat cross-legged on the cold floor, the ledger open across my knees. The ink was steady, deliberate. At first glance, the entries looked like routine bookkeeping, supplies, wages, maintenance costs. But every few lines, there was a mark in the margin. Small sunrise symbol. I turned to the back of the ledger and found something I hadn't noticed before. The last 2 pages had been glued together. I ran my finger along the edge and felt the brittle seam give. Peeling it apart revealed a folded sheet of onion skin paper, thin as breath, tucked between them. It wasn't a letter. It was a cipher key. Columns of letters ran down the left side, numbers down the right. Each sunrise symbol in the ledger matched a number in this key, and the numbers pointed to words buried in the entries. I began decoding, my pulse quickening with every line that formed. When I finished, the message read, "Follow the eastern pipe to the second bleed valve. At dawn, the shadow will show the door. Bring the scarf." I closed the ledger and slid the cipher sheet into my pocket. The eastern pipe. My mind traced the irrigation map I'd found in the underground shaft. The second bleed valve sat just past the orchard fence, where the pipe curved toward the tree line. If dawn mattered, I had hours. Enough to leave now. Enough to get ahead of Lila and whoever she was working with. I slipped from the vault, retracing my steps through the dim records room and down the side corridor. The house was still quiet, though here and there I caught the faint sounds of distant movement. A door shutting upstairs, the muted clang of something metallic in the kitchen. The north servant's door was still locked, but the old window beside it had a latch that came free with a sharp tug. I slid it up, slipped out, and dropped into the shrubs below. Cold air slapped my face, and the night closed around me like a cloak. The path to the orchard fence was longer in the dark, the frost underfoot crunching too loudly. I skirted the edges of the gardens, past the skeletal dogwoods, until the orchard came into view. Rows of bare trees like black ribs against the faint starlight. The second bleed valve was just where the map had shown it, a small metal cap protruding from the soil. I crouched beside it and scanned the ground. No sign of footprints. That meant Lila hadn't been here yet. I wrapped my scarf tighter and sat on the cold ground, my back against the fence post, waiting for the horizon to pale. The cold gnawed at my fingers and toes, but I didn't move. When dawn came, it did so slowly. First the lightening of the sky, then the faint burn of gold edging the tops of the orchard trees. The shadow I was waiting for appeared like a blade, cast by the fence post and stretching across the frosted ground toward the base of a nearby oak. Followed it. The oak's roots curled over a small, flat stone half buried in the soil. The sunrise symbol was etched into it, almost worn away. I dug with my hands, the cold biting through my gloves until they were numb. After a few inches, my fingers struck wood. I cleared the soil until I could lift it, a shallow box lighter than I expected. Inside was a single envelope and an old photograph. The photo showed my mother standing in the orchard, the scarf I now wore looped around her neck, and my grandfather beside her. Both were smiling. The envelope was unsealed. Inside was a short note in my grandfather's hand. If they told you she ran, they lied. She left to keep you safe. And when you are ready, this is where you will find her. Beneath the note was a folded slip of paper with an address in a small coastal town 2 hours away. My throat tightened. Somewhere my mother was alive. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of movement from the far end of the orchard. I slipped the photograph, note, and address into my coat and buried the box again, covering it with soil and frost. When I looked up, I saw a figure standing at the fence line, half hidden by shadow. Layla. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood watching as I turned and walked toward the edge of the estate, the scarf warm against my neck, the address burning like a beacon in my pocket. I didn't look back.